Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford. One of the most frequent explanations that I hear given for why someone has become interested in the topics that I discuss on my Patreon-supported YouTube channel, full of more than 600 videos about Norse language, myth, runes, Vikings, etc., is that so-and-so has found out that he or she is descended from some kind of Viking royalty, perhaps an old Viking times Danish king like Haraldur Blåtand, or Bluetooth, or a Norwegian king like Haraldur Hårfagre, fair hair. But it is not very likely at all that any particular person living today can document a particular connection to an individual living at that time. Now, there's scientific reasons for that I won't get into because I'm not a scientist, I'm a scholar of language and literature. But I'll mention that it's my understanding that you might well be descended from someone 1,000 years ago and yet have virtually no genetic signature from that person because, of course, the further back you go in time, the fewer of the people that you're technically a descendant of are going to be reflected in your personal genetic material. But again, I'm not a scientist, it's not what I want to focus on. I want to talk about the reason why, as a scholar of Old Norse language and literature, I don't trust genealogies from that far back. Now, we do find, of course, genealogies in Old Norse literature, extensive genealogies sometimes, and in some particular circumstances, those can be fairly reliable. For example, some families in Iceland have pretty reliable records going back several hundred years and can connect known ancestors to known people mentioned in sagas, and then those people mentioned in the sagas might have genealogies that stretch back into the Viking Age. I would say that with each generation, you're going to get a little bit less reliable in those sources, but for Icelanders, there may be some pretty well documentable chains of ancestry, at least going back into the early Middle Ages. And then if you have ancestry in the last couple hundred years from very high status people in Scandinavia, right? Nobles, very wealthy merchants, or perhaps military officers, things like that, you might have a decent case for tracking your way back to some medieval ancestor that can be documented pretty well. But for most of us descended from the peasants and commoners of the world, and I'm certainly one such, there just aren't going to be medieval genealogies, right? There's nowhere that is writing down, that John the Peasant had another son, John the Peasant Jr., right? Last names are a pretty recent invention in a lot of the world, and in Scandinavia, sometimes an extremely recent invention. Notice that in Iceland, in spite of the fact that it's actually a place that has really good genealogical records, they still don't use inherited last names, but instead use patronyms, right? So-and-so is so-and-so's son or so-and-so's daughter. But even on continental Scandinavia in the early 20th century, there were people still going by so-and-so's son, so-and-so's daughter. For instance, in rural parts of Norway and Sweden, I think Arne Garborg's father was a something son, and that the Garborg last name was a fairly recent invention in the family, and that was in the early 20th century. So, these current genealogy services, Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and whatever else comes along, I think that they can do, from what I can tell, a pretty good service when there's a lot of records. But once they start relying on medieval genealogies, for one thing, I wonder where the data is coming from. And when I don't wonder where the data is coming from, I wonder why they're trusting it. I'll give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost, and I'll rant about this in a little bit more detail for you. So when we do get genealogies in medieval sources like sagas, often the purpose of the genealogy is not recording facts, but rather demonstrating someone's claim to some particular land, some particular title, or showing that this cool person is descended from this other cool person that you've also heard about. So, for example, one of the sagas that Hackett Publishing has published my translation of, the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, takes a person who probably is very distantly based on a real person who lived in the 800s. It's Ragnar Lothbrok. And his sons, like Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake-Eye, Bjorn Ironside, who probably are just a little bit more likely to be based on real people than their dad. And, you know, again, these people living in the 800s AD, so early Viking Age. And it's trying to connect them to these deep, legendary, probably not at all historical figures of the mythical saga of the Volsungs. Right, so the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok is actually written as a sequel to the Saga of the Volsungs, and it makes Ragnar Lothbrok's second wife, Åslaug Kråka, the daughter of the dragon-slaying Volsung hero Sigurður and the Valkyrie Brynhildr. Now, the legends of Sigurður and Brynhildr, almost certainly, to judge from a lot of literary, and I would even say to a limited extent linguistic evidence, go back centuries before Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar Lothbrok himself would already have been hearing stories about Sigurður and Brynhildr as stories from long, long, long ago. And so they attempt to connect him as, you know, the next generation after them, is a little bit like trying to make me Andrew Jackson's son or something like that. And actually the distance is even further than that. It might be more like trying to make me Sir Francis Drake's son. Just because, you know, we might be connected to similar places, or in the case of Andrew Jackson, actually have a real relationship, although much more distant. So it's basically made up, right? The connection, it's an impossible connection that he would be their son-in-law, but it's accepted as quote-unquote sort of fact in these sagas. And so once you realize that the sagas are willing to stretch those connections and crunch those timelines down beyond recognizability, beyond reasonability, it makes me really question any of them, right? And then you look at a saga like the Saga of Ravnkel Saga Frøyskoða, and as demonstrated by Sigurður Nordal in the 1950s, you have these genealogies that look really realistic about people who seem very realistically drawn, but the entire story is basically a fiction. So while some works of, especially, again, Icelandic medieval writing, like Íslendingabók, Landnámabók, may well contain some real genealogies, they are almost without a doubt mixed with genealogies that are there for self-serving or power-glorifying purposes. Now, I'm not saying that if you have been exploring your family roots in Denmark or Norway or Sweden, that does not mean that you're descended from some kind of Viking royalty or nobility or some person that some saga was reworked to tell the story of. But I don't think that you can easily document it, and I don't trust medieval genealogies to be even half true most of the time, and I just don't think that without good records being there in the Middle Ages, that something like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, although it may connect you to the right, area, that it can connect you to specific individuals from back then that there aren't, remains of. I'm very skeptical. Now, on a somewhat related note, sometimes I get this weird spiel, especially from people writing for the first time into the comment form of my website, saying, like, well, Dr. Crawford, you must have some kind of Scandinavian ancestry. After all, you have Scottish ancestry, and Scotland was crawling with Vikings at one time. And yeah, that's true, but I actually don't know and don't care. I've never done one of these Ancestry or 23andMe things. Close family members have. I guess it's sort of interesting, but I'm very interested in history without being very interested in my specific ancestors so far back that there's just nothing I can know about them in particular, right? Pretty interested in ancestors that I can know something about, and that goes back in some cases to Jamestown, which I think is kind of neat, to know that there's a named ancestor there that I can know a little bit about, and know where he lived, and maybe even where he was born, or where he's buried, that kind of thing. But you go back 1,000 years, and I can't know anything about any of these particular people. So my interest in my own family history kind of expires at the point that I can't really know something about a particular person. And I'm actually the same way, by the way, about reconstructing languages, right? It's really interesting to me to get back to Proto-Indo-European and realize, here are the provable, documentable roots of English and the Slavic languages and Sanskrit and Hindi and Farsi. But to try to connect that to something else, there's not enough evidence there to document it, and so I lose interest because, what are you doing except speculating? I surprisingly unintrigued by that kind of speculating, and also reluctant just to spew speculation at y'all on this channel. Part of what I want to provide is good information where I have it, and a frank admission of what we just can't know when we just can't know. And genealogy, including probably your family's genealogy going that far back, is one of those subjects. Well, I hope if these videos help you out in understanding the past, or languages and runes that you're interested in, or Norse myths, that you'll consider supporting me on Patreon to help me keep these going twice a week for more than 5 years. It's been quite a run. And for now, from beautiful Utah, thank you to my Patreon supporters, and to everyone out there, all the best.